He thought he could silence her by burning her ID. He didn't know who she was. The dim glow of streetlights illuminated the empty road as Rachel Matthews made her way home. It had been a long day, one filled with deadlines, court filings, and countless phone calls. Her body ached from the constant hustle, but there was a lightness in her heart, knowing that soon she'd be home with her 2 kids. The thought of hearing their laughter, even as they made a mess in the kitchen, made her smile. It was the simple moments that brought her peace. As she neared an intersection, something about the stillness of the night felt off. Her instincts tingled, but she pushed the feeling aside. The town she lived in was usually quiet at night, and the drive home was uneventful. Rachel glanced at the clock on her dashboard. 6:43 p.m. Only a few more minutes, she told herself. Dinner, a little TV with the kids, and then a well-deserved rest. She was looking forward to the small pleasures of being at home. But the calm was shattered when the familiar red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror. Rachel's stomach sank. She hadn't been speeding or breaking any laws, yet here she was, being pulled over. Her heart raced, and she instinctively gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. She'd been stopped before, but this time something felt different. The officer's approach was slow, deliberate. There was a coldness in the air that made Rachel uneasy. As the officer stepped out of his cruiser, his silhouette towering against the flashing lights, Rachel tried to steady herself. She rolled down her window, her fingers trembling slightly, and prepared herself for the usual routine. Show the documents, answer the questions, and be on her way. But as the officer drew closer, something in his demeanor made her pause. It wasn't just a routine stop. It was something else, something personal. The officer's eyes met hers, and she could feel his scrutiny piercing through her, making her feel like she didn't belong there. When he asked for her license and registration, his tone was flat, almost devoid of any empathy. Rachel handed over the documents, her breath steady despite the sinking feeling in her chest. But when he returned to his cruiser, lingering longer than necessary, she couldn't shake the sense that this wasn't just about a minor infraction. Rachel tried to push the uneasy thoughts aside, but the pit in her stomach deepened. What was this officer really looking for? Minutes dragged by as Rachel sat in her car, the tension building with every second. She could feel the weight of the officer's gaze, even though he was still seated in his cruiser. The street seemed unnervingly quiet now, and her heart pounded louder with every beat. She wasn't sure why she felt this sense of dread. Maybe it was the officer's deliberate movements, or the way he hadn't even bothered to explain why he'd pulled her over in the first place. When he finally returned, it was with a changed air about him. His posture was rigid, his expression no longer neutral, but hard and unyielding. Rachel's hands instinctively clenched around the steering wheel. The officer wasn't just holding her documents, he was waving them in the air as if they were something beneath him. His voice dropped, dripping with accusation. "This doesn't look right," he said, his eyes narrowing suspiciously at the license. Rachel blinked in confusion, the words catching her off guard. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to keep her tone calm. "That's my ID, officer. It's valid." But the officer wasn't listening. He stepped closer, scrutinizing the card in his hands with an almost mocking air. "Are you sure this is yours?" His words were sharp, not curious, as if he was already deciding her guilt before she even had a chance to explain. The implication in his voice, the unspoken judgment, was enough to make Rachel's chest tighten. "Of course it's mine," she responded, her voice firmer now, though she could feel the tension building inside. She hadn't done anything wrong, yet she was being made to feel as though she had. Her nerves began to fray. What was going on? This wasn't a normal traffic stop, not by a long shot. Without warning, he raised his hand in a swift gesture, silencing her. "I'll see about that," he muttered, turning on his heel and walking back to his cruiser. The faintest feeling of unease gnawed at Rachel, but she held her ground. The minutes felt like hours as she waited, unsure of what was to come next. As Rachel sat in her car, the seconds felt like an eternity. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her thoughts raced. What had just happened? What was the officer really after? She knew she hadn't done anything wrong. The feeling of unease continued to creep through her like an unwelcome shadow, refusing to let go. The officer finally returned, his steps heavy as he approached her window once more. This time, however, something was different. His posture was rigid, like a soldier bracing for a fight. He didn't even look at her directly. His eyes were fixed on the ID in his hand, a sneer curling on his lips. He held the card between his fingers, as if it were a piece of garbage, mocking the very thing he was supposed to be respecting. "This looks fake," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. Rachel's stomach lurched. The words hit her harder than she expected. Fake? It was a legitimate ID, issued by the state. Her mind whirled as she searched for words to respond, but they were slow to come. "That's my ID," she said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady, but she could feel the sting of disbelief settling in. "It's valid. You can check it in your system." The officer didn't flinch. Instead, he raised his hand and flicked open a lighter from his pocket, a sickening smirk playing on his face. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. What was he doing? Maybe this will teach you a lesson," he sneered. The small flame from the lighter danced in the air, too close for comfort, and Rachel's eyes widened in horror as he brought it down toward the ID. Her heart pounded in her chest as she instinctively jerked forward. "Wait, you can't," she began, her voice rising in panic. But it was too late. In one fluid motion, the officer set the edge of her ID alight. The acrid smell of burning plastic filled the car as the flame grew, curling the ID's edges into dark, charred remnants. Rachel sat there, frozen, as the officer casually dropped the remains onto the asphalt at her feet. The destruction of something so essential to her identity, her right to exist as a legitimate person in society, felt like a punch to the gut. Her voice trembled with a mix of anger and disbelief as she asked, "Why would you do that?" With a dismissive sneer, the officer turned and walked back to his cruiser, leaving Rachel in stunned silence. The road, the evening air, the weight of the burned ID at her feet, everything felt surreal, but deep within her, a fire ignited. This wasn't over. Rachel sat in her car, staring at the remnants of her ID, now just a pile of blackened plastic on the pavement. Her hands trembled, not from fear but from a simmering anger that threatened to boil over. She felt violated, not just by the officer's actions, but by the blatant disregard for her dignity. No one should have to face this kind of treatment, especially not by someone who swore an oath to serve and protect. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. Her children were waiting for her at home, and she couldn't let her emotions get the best of her, not yet. As the officer's car sped off into the night, leaving her behind in a haze of frustration and disbelief, Rachel knew one thing for certain. This wasn't going to end like this. She wasn't going to let this abuse slide. Rachel's first instinct was to call someone who could help her, someone who understood the law and the weight of what had just happened. Her fingers fumbled for her phone as she dialed Elliot's number, her trusted attorney and friend. The moment he answered, Rachel recounted everything. She spoke slowly but deliberately, detailing the officer's behavior, his words, the burning of her ID, and the sickening feeling of being targeted. "You've got the dashcam footage, right?" Elliot's voice was steady, reassuring, even as he processed the gravity of her situation. "Yeah, it recorded everything," Rachel said, her voice hardening with resolve. His words, the lighter, everything. Elliot's response was firm and immediate. "Good. Don't worry. We'll handle this. He messed with the wrong person." Rachel exhaled, a small but significant relief sweeping over her. She wasn't alone. She was going to fight this, not just for herself, but for anyone who had been humiliated, dehumanized, or unjustly targeted by those who should have been serving and protecting them. The officer may have thought he could silence her, intimidate her, make her feel small, but he was wrong. She wasn't going to be silenced. The next morning, with her dashcam footage securely stored, Elliot filed a formal complaint with the police department. The footage was undeniable. The officer's actions were nothing short of misconduct. Rachel's case quickly gained traction, and soon the local news picked it up. Her story was no longer just about her. It had become a rallying cry for the community. One woman's fight for justice had become the spark for a larger conversation about accountability, fairness, and racial profiling. Rachel knew it wouldn't be easy, but this was only the beginning. The officer had underestimated her, but now the truth was coming to light. Rachel Matthews spent the next few days in a whirlwind of emotions. The shock of the incident hadn't fully worn off, but the fire inside her was burning brighter with every passing hour. The news of her case spread quickly, and her phone buzzed incessantly with messages of support from strangers, activists, and even former law enforcement officers who condemned the officer's actions. It was overwhelming, but it gave Rachel the strength she needed to keep pushing forward. Elliot kept her updated as the police department began its investigation, but Rachel knew the battle wasn't just about holding one officer accountable, it was about changing the system. Her experience was not an isolated one. Countless people had suffered in silence, victims of unchecked power, biased assumptions, and a lack of accountability. She wasn't going to let that silence continue. At a community meeting, Rachel stood before a crowd of supporters, activists, and leaders, her heart pounding with purpose. The room was full, and the energy was palpable as people shared their stories of mistreatment by law enforcement. Rachel listened, her heart heavy but resolute. Each voice added weight to her own. When it was her turn, she stepped up to the microphone, her posture strong but her voice unwavering. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice carrying through the room. "This is about everyone who has ever been treated unfairly, everyone who has been judged, humiliated, and stripped of their dignity just because someone thought they could. We can't let this go on any longer." The room erupted in applause. Rachel's words weren't just her own, they were the words of countless others who had felt powerless. In that moment she realized that this fight was bigger than herself. It was about breaking the cycle, about making sure no one had to go through what she had. Back in the courtroom, Rachel was preparing for the moment that would change everything. As she sat in the witness stand, she looked across the room at the officer who had tried to destroy her. His smug expression still burned in her memory. The dashcam footage played, the officer's words, his actions, all laid bare for the jury to see. Rachel could feel the weight of every eye in the room, but she wasn't afraid. She was fighting for truth. She was fighting for change. As the verdict came in, guilty of misconduct and abuse of authority, Rachel didn't feel triumph, but a deep sense of purpose. The fight wasn't over, but it was a victory, not just for her, but for everyone who had been silenced by fear. The days following the trial verdict brought a new sense of resolve for Rachel. Though the officer's dismissal was a victory, the deeper issues still loomed large. Rachel knew that this case, while monumental for her, was only one piece of the larger puzzle. The broken system that allowed such behavior to persist would not be fixed overnight. It needed a collective effort, a shift in how authority was wielded, how biases were addressed, and how accountability was demanded. As she walked through the streets of Bakersfield, Rachel felt the weight of the responsibility on her shoulders. She had become a symbol of resistance, of the quiet strength it took to stand up against the tide. But the work didn't stop with her case. She was determined to ensure that no one else would be treated the way she had been, not in her community, not anywhere. Her first move was to establish the Legal Aid Fund for victims of racial profiling, ensuring that others who found themselves in situations like hers had the resources and support to fight back. Rachel knew how overwhelming the system could be, especially for those who were financially disadvantaged. She wanted to give them a voice, a way to make their stories heard. The Legal Aid Fund would become a lifeline for many, a place where the marginalized could find help and hope. In addition to the fund, Rachel began working closely with local organizations that advocated for police reform. She was invited to speak at rallies, on panels, and even in classrooms, educating the next generation about the importance of justice, fairness, and empathy. Her story became a beacon for change, sparking a larger conversation about the abuse of power and the need for reform in law enforcement practices. Rachel had turned her pain into power, using her voice and her platform to challenge the very systems that had once failed her. Despite the toll it took on her, Rachel felt a sense of peace. The fire that had ignited within her after that fateful night had only grown stronger. She was no longer just a survivor of an unjust system. She was a fighter, and her mission was far from over. The future wasn't perfect, but with every step, every conversation, every legal victory, Rachel was getting closer to the change she had set out to create. As the weeks passed, Rachel's efforts began to take root in her community. The legal aid fund grew, attracting donors who were moved by her courage and the cause she championed. Her involvement with police reform organizations gained momentum, and soon she found herself in meetings with lawmakers, advocating for stronger policies to protect individuals from racial profiling and police misconduct. Rachel's voice, once silenced by fear and intimidation, was now echoing in rooms that had previously ignored the needs of marginalized communities. However, the journey was not without its challenges. Rachel faced resistance from some local authorities who were reluctant to acknowledge the need for change. But she pressed on, determined to hold them accountable. She knew that real change would require more than just a public outcry. It would require a sustained effort, a reworking of the systems that perpetuated discrimination and abuse. Her resolve hardened with every setback. She learnt to embrace the discomfort of confrontation, recognizing that in order to break the cycle of injustice, the status quo had to be challenged, no matter how powerful the institutions resisting change might be. One day, while walking to a meeting with a community group, Rachel received a message from Elliot, her attorney and trusted friend. The officer who had tormented her months earlier had been implicated in other incidents of misconduct, and a major investigation into his actions was now underway. Rachel felt a sense of relief wash over her. The officer's exposure was just one victory in the fight for justice, but it symbolized the beginning of something larger, an awakening within her city, her state, and beyond. Rachel's case had sparked a ripple effect that was spreading throughout the nation. People were waking up to the realities of police misconduct, and they were speaking out. Rachel smiled as she read the message. This wasn't just about her fight anymore, it was a movement fueled by those who had been silenced, by those who had lived in fear, and by those who dared to demand change. As she continued her work, Rachel never forgot the most important lesson she had learned through her ordeal, that silence allows injustice to thrive, but one voice, no matter how small, has the power to shift the course of history. The message was clear: change starts with us. If Rachel's story moved you, remember that your actions, no matter how small, can create a ripple that makes waves of change. Let's continue to stand up for what's right, and fight for a world where everyone's voice is heard. Rachel's story highlights the power of standing up against injustice and the importance of speaking out, especially when systems of authority fail to protect the vulnerable. In today's world, many people experience mistreatment or discrimination but remain silent, out of fear or uncertainty. Rachel's decision to take action not only brought attention to her own experience, but also sparked a movement that resonated with many others. Her case serves as a powerful reminder that the first step toward change is speaking up, even when it feels difficult or uncomfortable. Whether it's confronting an unfair situation at work, addressing biases in our communities, or demanding accountability from those in power, we all have the ability to create change. It's important to recognize that silence can often perpetuate harmful systems, and each of us has the responsibility to challenge discrimination and fight for justice. For those facing similar situations, take note from Rachel's resilience. Don't be afraid to stand up for yourself and others. Use the tools at your disposal, whether it's legal resources, community support, or social media, to make your voice heard. Change is often slow, but every step we take contributes to a larger movement for equality and fairness. Be courageous in your actions, and know that your voice, no matter how small it may seem, can have a significant impact on the world around you.